us a lot of great new Hyper-V features, many of which we'll be covering throughout this section of nuggets. Just to name a few of them, we can now add and remove network interface cards and memory on the fly without shutting our machines down. We also have a new feature known as direct device assignment, where we can give our VMs direct access to physical hardware, improving performance. We also have host resource protection, so a VM can't run away with the resources on a host machine. It supports Linux Secure Boot, production, and standard checkpoints, as well as nested virtualization and PowerShell Direct. Now, many of those new features, along with the optimizations that have been built into Hyper-V, and especially when coupled with the new features that have been built in to REFS, the resilient file system, is all going to result in improved performance and better security. It's also had its limits cranked up so we can pack even more resources into our Hyper-V host. The number of logical processors has nearly doubled since Server 2012. We're up to 512. And look at how much memory we can now pack into a Hyper-V host, from 4 terabytes up to 24 terabytes. We also have great support for our guest operating systems. We can create virtual machines that contain operating systems on the server side all the way back to Server 2008 and up. And on the client side, Windows 7 and up. And also good support for many Linux distros out there: CentOS, Red Hat, Debian, SUSE, Ubuntu, and FreeBSD. Now, before we can turn a machine into a Hyper-V host, there are some hardware requirements that need to be met. Now, keep in mind, these are requirements specifically for the Hyper-V role itself, for the hypervisor, not for the tools. So we can still install the tools on a machine that does not support these requirements and still remotely manage our Hyper-V host. So the first thing we need to make sure that we have is a SLAT-capable 64-bit processor. SLAT stands for second level address translation. We also need the VM monitor mode extensions for the hypervisor, and then we need our BIOS or UEFI firmware to support hardware-assisted virtualization as well as data execution prevention. Now, you can easily see if your target host supports these 4 requirements by running a little command line utility known as system info. This will list all 4 of these requirements and either a yes or no next to them. We'll look at that in the virtual lab here shortly. Another thing you may want to do is upgrade your old Server 2012 Hyper-V host to Server 2016 to take advantage of all these features. Now, as we know, the recommended procedure for upgrading anything in Windows is to perform a clean installation and then migrate our roles and our data, or in this case, our VMs, over to our new host. Now, you certainly could perform an in-place upgrade of your old Hyper-V host, but you'll still need to get your machines off of that host, especially if you don't want to incur any downtime. In either case, we're going to need to get our VMs off of that old host. And there's a number of ways we can do that, all of which are going to depend how much downtime you can incur. If downtime isn't an issue, we could perform an export of those VMs off of our old host. Export is an offline operation. And then we can either import them over to our new host or import them back to our old host once that in-place upgrade is complete. If downtime is an issue, we can perform a live migration, which will take a running VM and move it over to another host with no service interruption. We'll actually get to look at that great feature when we get into our section on high availability. We'll look at live migration, shared nothing live migration, and Hyper-V Replica, which is a disaster recovery solution for our VMs. Now, whether you're doing an in-place upgrade or a clean install plus migration, there is one very important final step you will need to do, and that is upgrade your virtual machine's configuration version. Your VMs were created in a previous version of Hyper-V, so they won't be able to take advantage of all the new Hyper-V Server 2016 features unless you upgrade them to the latest configuration version. It's very simple to do. You can do it in Hyper-V Manager using the GUI, or you can do it with a very simple PowerShell commandlet. With that, let's jump into the virtual lab and learn how to stand up a couple of Hyper-V hosts. All right, we're going to step it up a notch here in our lab environment. The first thing I want to point out here is we now have an admin node. This is still a Windows 10 client machine, but it plays the role of our remote administrative workstation with all the remote server administration tools on it. We'll still use client NUG whenever we need to assume the role of a user. So now we have that clear distinction between our Windows 10 machine and a user's Windows 10 machine. Next up, we have both of our Hyper-V hosts that we're going to be managing from admin NUG, HV1 NUG and HV2 NUG. HV1 NUG is server with the desktop experience, and HV2 NUG is nano server. And we know installing roles on either of these installation options is very different, so you'll get to see both perspectives. And then we've also transformed our domain controller into a server core machine. So check it out. We've got every Windows Server installation option covered in this lab. Well, let's begin. In fact, we're going to do everything on our admin NUG machine. We're not even going to touch these machines locally. We're going to do everything remotely. So let's start here by logging on to admin NUG. So I've installed all the remote server administration tools onto our Windows 10 admin NUG machine, and even pinned Server Manager down here to the taskbar, and that's where we're going to start. So let's go ahead and fire up Server Manager. And if we choose all servers, notice that we don't have any servers in here right now. So let's hit that Manage menu and choose Add Servers. Let's go ahead and hit Find Now to browse Active Directory, and let's add DCNUG, HV1NUG, and HV2NUG into the selected area. Give each one of those a double click and hit OK. And this will just take a second to communicate with them, validate our credentials, and there we go. And then it'll scan all those machines to see what roles and features are on them. Notice we do not have Hyper-V installed on any of these machines. So HV1NUG, again, is our desktop experience host, and HV2NUG is our nano server host. Now, a few things I want to point out. The Hyper-V management tools, that's the GUI tool Hyper-V Manager, and the PowerShell module is not a part of remote server administration tools. In fact, if we drop down the tools menu, you will not see Hyper-V Manager in here. And again, we don't have access to the PowerShell commandlets for managing Hyper-V either. So we are going to need to install just those tools on this machine so we can remotely manage both of our Hyper-V hosts. Another thing I want to point out is we could install the Hyper-V role remotely using Server Manager here in the Add Roles and Features wizard, but only for HV1NUG because it is the desktop experience. And that would also work against a server core machine, but it will not work for our nano server machine. And we're going to do all of this stuff using PowerShell, but just to show you here, if we drop down the Manage menu, choose Add Roles and Features, I just want to highlight the difference of doing this through the GUI with PowerShell. And let's hit Next until we get to Server Selection. Choose HV1NUG. Again, this won't work for HV2NUG since that's nano server. Hit Next. And on server roles, let's go ahead and hit Hyper-V. Now, would you want to install the management tools on our Hyper-V machine? Probably, just in case the network was down for whatever reason or we couldn't perform any remote management. We could still put the tools on there in case we need to do anything locally. I'll just go ahead and hit Add Features. We're going to cancel out of this wizard eventually, so it doesn't matter. But what I want to point out here is that going through the wizard here will set you up with some defaults. It'll create a default virtual switch and bind it to an adapter. You can configure live migration, and you can set up default locations for your hard disk and your virtual machine configuration files. Doing this through PowerShell, which is what we're going to do, will not give us a head start and not set up those defaults, which is fine because we're going to set those up along the way as we go through all of our Hyper-V nuggets. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and cancel out of this, and we're going to install Hyper-V using PowerShell for both HV1NUG and HV2NUG. So you can guess where we're going next, right? Yeah, we're going to get it into the ISC. So give that PowerShell icon on the taskbar a right click, and we need to launch the ISC with elevated privileges. So run it as an administrator and hit yes. All right, in the ISC, let's go ahead and close out of Untitled 1 here. Hit that open button on the toolbar. Let's browse right through this PC, through the C drive. We have a Nugget Lab directory and root of the C drive, and open up ps-commands.ps1. So we're going to start here by getting Hyper-V installed on our HV1NUG machine. Then we'll get it installed on our nano server, HV2NUG machine, and then we'll get the tools installed on our local admin NUG machine so we can remotely manage both of them. But before we do any of that, we need to make sure that our hardware layer supports virtualization on both of these machines. A couple of ways to do that. First, though, let's launch into a PowerShell session. Here we go. And I'm just going to go ahead and center this a little better. Here we go. And let's start by entering a PS session onto HV1NUG, just like so. That'll just take a second. I'll CD back to the root here just so we have less to look at. There we go. And now all we need to do is run a system info. This is one way of doing it, like we talked about back on the whiteboard. And the very last result from this command will show us Hyper-V requirements. If you meet all the requirements, it's just going to send you a one-liner back here saying a hypervisor has been detected. You're good to go. If not, it'll list all 4 of those requirements out with a yes or no flag next to it. Another way to do this, and by the way, system info will not work on nano server. It's not a part of it, but there's another way that we can do it. In fact, let's exit out of this session here. All right, we're back on our local machine. And let's enter another PS session, only this time over to our nano server, HV2NUG. Let me get my mouse out of the way there. There we go. All right, so we're back. Now we're over on our nano server, HV2NUG. And this one, we can run a get computer info. This will give us the same information, except it'll break it all down a little better. And this will also come at the very bottom here. Hypervisor present. If that's true, it's just going to ignore all the other hardware requirements. But if that's false, then it'll say yes or no for each one of these. So there's DEP, data execution prevention. There's SLAT, second level address translation. There is hardware-assisted virtualization there, the firmware, and there's your VM monitor mode extensions. So those are the 2 ways that you can view and see that the hardware level supports virtualization. We're good on both of these machines, so let's head back to the ISC. So let's begin here on HV1NUG. We're going to run an install Windows feature. Pass in HV1NUG as our target for remote installation. Hyper-V is the name of the role, and we will include the management tools. Now, one thing I want to show you real quick before we do that, I'm going to highlight everything up to there, copy it, go up 1 level, and paste it in here. We're going to turn this install into a get. Let's just see what's on there, and what's available in the Hyper-V role here. And we're also going to surround this with wildcards so we can see everything. There we go. Now, if we run this, it's just going to run a quick query over there against HV1NUG. Here is the role, and here are those tools. So installing the role and passing in the include management tools flag will essentially install everything. But if you only wanted to install specific things, here's how you could do it on the server side. All right, I'm going to hit Control-R to go back, and now let's perform the installation. So line number 6 here for me, I'm going to highlight that, hit execute, and it'll just take a second to install and reboot the machine, which is required when you perform a Hyper-V installation. All right, that's done. Notice the message here. It's rebooting as we speak because we did include the restart flag. I'm going to go split screen here, and now let's do this on our nano server machine, HV2NUG. We'll do this right on that machine. So let's enter a PS session on to HV2NUG. All right, cool. We're on this machine. I'm going to navigate back to the root here just so we have less to look at. There we go. We're on HV2NUG. Now, I already installed the nano server package provider, but we still need to import it to get access to all those commandlets. So I'm going to go ahead and run an import here. That'll give us access to all of the nano server commandlets and in that provider. All right, and all the commandlets within. So that'll just take a second. Cool, it's imported. Now, if we just see what we currently have on this machine as far as packages go, we'll run a get package targeting that provider. So we can see all the nano server packages on this machine. So this is our nano server from a previous Nugget. It has all the latest updates applied to it, and it still has IIS on it. We're probably going to want to remove that, and we could easily do that with an uninstall nano server package. But what I really wanted to point out here is I did need to add the storage package because this is where REFS comes from. So you will not be able to format a volume with the resilient file system if you do not have the storage package on. So I went ahead and added that on here. And by the way, just to show you here, if we run a get volume, you'll notice that I also created a volume. We have a 100 gigabyte disk attached to this machine. I formatted it as our V volume, labeled it VM data with REFS. So this is perfect for storing all of our virtual machines down the road. And I have the same exact volume attached to our first Hyper-V host, HV1NUG. So we're ready to go as far as the file system goes and our volumes go. Perfect storage for our virtual machines. Another thing I want to point out here is if we run a find package using the provider name nano server package, this will show us all the available packages. And the one we're really interested in here to turn this into a Hyper-V machine is the compute package right here. So this is what we're going to need to pass in to the install nano server package commandlet. That will install Hyper-V onto our nano server machine, and we'll have 2 Hyper-V hosts ready to go. So I'm going to place my cursor right on this line here, hit run selection, and that'll just take a minute to install the Hyper-V role onto our nano server machine, and then we'll give it a reboot, and we'll be done. And it's done, and we get the same message there that we need to restart in order to complete installation. No problem. We've got the restart computer commandlet for that, and boom, done. So that should also kill our session here. If you hit enter a few times, it'll say, oh, where'd the session go? And then eventually bounces back to our local machine here. All right, there we go. So while that's going on, let's do our final task here, which is installing Hyper-V Manager, the GUI tool, as well as the PowerShell commandlets here so we can remotely administer both of those hosts. Now, install Windows feature is unsupported, not available on client OSs, but get Windows optional feature is. So we're going to use this, specify it's an online operation, and specify our feature name. And just this first one's here is just going to give us a list of all the available features on this machine. It's going to show us all the Hyper-V stuff here on Windows 10. And by the way, you can also do this through the GUI. If you right-click on the Start button, head up to Programs and Features, and in here, choose Turn Windows Features On or Off. Hyper-V has its own section here. There it is, because we could turn Windows 10 into a Hyper-V host as well. So this is what we're after, these tools right here. So here's one way that you can do it. And just to prove to you here that it's not a part of remote server administration tools, you will not see it in here at all. Cool, because it comes packed onto our operating systems. So back in the ISE, we're going to need the names of those features in order to install them. So if we scroll up here, you're going to see the Hyper-V Management PowerShell feature name. This will give us access to just the PowerShell commandlets. And then we have the Hyper-V Management Clients, which will give us access to the Hyper-V Management tool. We can do both of those in one shot if we specify Microsoft Hyper-V Tools All. This will install everything. And you also need to include the All switch on the end of that so it includes everything underneath it, right? That's just the kind of the parent that contains both of those tools. So let's run an enable Windows optional feature as an online operation, pass all those in, hit run, and this should do the trick. Once that's done, we're going to need to reboot our local machine, so hit yes there and give this a second to complete installation. We're back, and it's time for the moment of truth. Are you ready? Let's fire up Server Manager from the taskbar. And the first thing we should see is a Hyper-V node on the left. Awesome, look at that. And if you click on it, you'll see both HV1NUG and HV2NUG show up here in our results. Beautiful. Next test, let's drop down that Tools menu and launch Hyper-V Manager. All right, we'll maximize this. It's going to show our local machine in here. We don't want that in here. We don't even have Hyper-V installed on our local machine. So let's remove that. And now let's right-click on Hyper-V Manager, choose Connect to Server. Let's go ahead and type in HV1NUG there. Hit OK. Awesome, there it is. And let's do that again for HV2NUG. Right-click, Connect to Server, HV2NUG. And there it is. Look at that. We can manage both of them. Now we can start creating VMs on both of these and easily flip between them. In fact, if you right-click and choose Hyper-V Settings, we can even start modifying the settings of those Hyper-V hosts remotely for both our desktop experience and even our Nano server. And what's great about this is whichever machine we're doing work on, like let's say we wanted to create a VM over there on HV1NUG, it's going to be referencing the resources on that machine. So if I were to say, you know what, we want to store this in a different spot on the machine, you hit browse, we are browsing HV1NUG's file system. Look at that, there's the V drive over on HV1NUG. And the same would hold true against our Nano server. So we are all set and